In this video, I'll be sharing 13 sock knitting tips. If you're a subscriber, welcome back. If you're new to my channel, welcome. I'm happy to have you here. I do have a monthly newsletter, so you can subscribe to that if you're interested in keeping up with my teaching appearances and upcoming knitwear designs. You can also click the checkbox to get YouTube Live reminders in your email inbox, or you can subscribe to my channel here and hit the notification bell to be notified each time I go live or post a new video. So I have a list of 13 sock knitting tips in no particular order that I wanted to share with you today. My first tip is to weigh your yarn and divide it into two equally sized balls. Whether or not you're working two at a time, toe up, or however you're working them, this lets you know how much yarn you can use in each sock. My next tip is to go down a needle size on just the sole of the sock foot, and this can tighten up the gauge and make the sole of the sock a little harder wearing. Now keep in mind this may affect the fit, so you may need to do a gauge swatch to see exactly how much the size of the sock will change by changing the needle size in just the sole. My next tip is to trust the pattern, especially at the heel. Now it's true there could be an error in the pattern, but usually there's not. And if you're a newer sock knitter, especially the sock heels can be a little tricky. So just do what the pattern tells you to, and it should all work out. My next tip is to pick a yarn that has a reinforcing fiber built right into it. So reinforcing fibers are fibers such as nylon, acrylic, silk, and mohair. Using a yarn that has this reinforcing fiber built in will help your socks be harder wearing and more resistant to holes. To go along with picking a yarn that will be hard wearing, work at a gauge that is tight enough so that the socks will be nice and hard wearing as well. Tighter gauges will help the yarn move around less and have less friction against itself as it's being worn inside shoes. Another tip related to your yarn choice is to pick a yarn that has elasticity. So fibers such as wool are elastic in and of themselves, and so wool yarn is a great yarn to use for socks. Cotton is not elastic, so you need to look for a yarn, if you're using a cotton-based yarn, you need to look for a yarn that has some kind of elastic fiber, either elastic itself or some wool built into the yarn to add some elasticity. If you're looking for easier care, you could go with a superwash wool. That would get you the best of both worlds, where you would get the elasticity from the wool and easier care. My next tip is to check your gauge. Longtime sock knitters may not need to check their gauge, but it's always a good idea to check your gauge. Now you could check your gauge as you go and use the sock as your swatch, but keep in mind your sock on the needles is not blocked. So if you're using a new fiber, it might have different behaviors once it's blocked, and you could be surprised once you wash your socks for the first time. My next tip is to make sure you use a stretchy cast on if you're working cuff down, or a stretchy bind off if you're working toe up. This sock needs to stretch to go over your heel and instep diameter, and this diameter can be a little larger than you may think. If the top of the cuff doesn't stretch enough, it could be a little tight going on over your heel. I have a tip for how to avoid ladders. When working with double pointed needles, make sure you bring that new needle underneath the old needle to form the first stitch. And this makes that distance between the last stitch on the last needle and the first stitch on the next needle snugger, and make the first couple of stitches a little tighter on the new DPN. When picking up your gusset stitches, if you're working a heel flap sock, make sure you get both legs of the selvage stitch. This helps to make that pickup edge more sturdy. I have just a fabric sample here. It's not a sock, but this I have just a fabric sample here, not a sock, but hopefully you can get the idea. So you will go under both legs of the selvage stitch to pick up your stitches, as opposed to just one leg of the selvage. So going under both legs helps to create a nice sturdy pickup edge. You could knit these stitches through the back loop to tighten them up on your first round if you would like. I don't do that, and my tension seems to be nice and tight enough. But if you find that your tension is loose and you don't like how loose those stitches look to you, you could knit them through the back loop. My next tip is for new sock knitters. Make sure you use a nice vanilla pattern or a plain pattern and use thicker yarn for your first pair on a little bit larger needles. This can make your first pair easier and quicker to work. Then you can move on to thinner yarns, and once you have a few pairs under your belt, it will be a breeze to knit socks. My next tip is to make sure you use stitch markers that are nice and thin so that you don't introduce ladders into your fabric. And my last tip is to weave in your ends on the top side of the sock so that you don't add bulk to the bottom soles of your socks to affect the feel when the socks are being worn. So those were 13 sock knitting tips in no particular order. Which one was your favorite? Let me know in the comments below. Do you have a tip to share? Pop those in the comments below as well. I hope this was helpful. Thank you so much for watching, and happy knitting.